Between 1864 and 1965, a single factory in Elgin, Illinois produced nearly 60 million watches. At its peak, more than 4,000 workers passed through its gates every day, operating one of the largest and most sophisticated watchmaking operations the United States had ever built. Inside its massive brick buildings along the Fox River, thousands of microscopic components, gears smaller than a fingernail, delicate springs, jeweled bearings, were assembled with astonishing precision into machines designed to measure the smallest unit humans could control: time. For nearly a century, the Elgin National Watch Company was not just another manufacturer, it was America's timekeeper. Its watches synchronized railroad networks, stretching across thousands of miles of track. They traveled with soldiers into World War I and World War II. They sat in the pockets of bankers, engineers, merchants, and factory supervisors whose daily lives depended on accurate time in a rapidly industrializing nation. By the early 20th century, if an American owned a reliable watch, there was a strong chance that somewhere inside its case was a movement built in Elgin, Illinois. The company had accomplished something that many experts once believed was impossible. It had taken one of the most delicate mechanical instruments ever invented and turned it into an industrial product. Mass-produced, standardized, scaled to a level that even the old watchmaking centers of Europe struggled to match. But there is something deeply strange about the story of Elgin. Because the factory that produced tens of millions of watches, employed thousands of skilled workers, and helped regulate the rhythm of American industrial life, no longer exists. And one of the most powerful watchmaking empires in American history has almost completely faded from public memory, which creates a remarkable paradox. For nearly a century, the Elgin National Watch Company helped millions of people measure time with extraordinary precision. Yet somehow, the company that mastered time itself could not survive its own century. So the question is unavoidable. How does a factory that produced 60 million watches, dominated American timekeeping, and powered an entire industrial town simply disappear? If you enjoy deeply researched stories about America's forgotten factories, industrial empires, and the cities they built, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments which lost factory or industrial giant you'd like us to explore next. Chapter 1. The Problem with Time in 19th Century America. In the middle of the 19th century, the United States was expanding faster than the systems designed to organize it. Railroads were pushing westward across the continent. Factories were rising in rapidly growing cities, and commerce was accelerating as goods and people began moving across distances that earlier generations could barely imagine. Yet beneath this dramatic expansion lay a fragile problem. America did not yet have a reliable system for measuring time. During the early 1800s, time was still determined locally. Each town sets its clocks according to the position of the sun. When the sun reached its highest point in the sky, that community declared it noon. A town only 30 miles away might reach noon several minutes earlier or later. For generations, this inconsistency had rarely mattered. In an agricultural society, in daily life followed daylight and seasonal rhythms, rather than strict schedules. But the arrival of the railroad changed that reality completely. By the 1850s and 1860s, thousands of miles of railway track were connecting American cities into a rapidly expanding transportation network. Trains carried passengers, livestock, raw materials, and manufactured goods across enormous distances. Many rail lines operated on single tracks, meaning trains traveling in opposite directions shared the same rails. To avoid collisions, railway companies depended on tightly coordinated timetables that dictated exactly when trains should arrive or depart. Even a few minutes of error could be catastrophic. During the mid-19th century, several serious rail accidents were linked to inaccurate timekeeping and poorly synchronized schedules. Engineers often relied on personal watches whose accuracy varied widely. Some mechanical watches lost several minutes per day, and cheaper models performed even worse. In an industry where heavy locomotives moved at high speeds along shared tracks, small errors in timekeeping could place two trains on the same stretch of rail at the same moment. Railroad companies quickly realized that reliable watches were not simply convenient tools. They were essential infrastructure. At the same time, the broader transformation of the American economy was increasing the demand for precise timekeeping. Industrial factories were reshaping the structure of work itself. Machines operated according to fixed shifts, workers arrived at specific hours, and factory whistles marked the beginning and end of work days that often stretched 10 or 12 hours. In rapidly growing industrial cities, punctuality became a form of economic discipline that organized both labor and production. Yet despite this growing demand, the United States lacked a strong domestic watchmaking industry. For centuries, watchmaking had been dominated by European artisans, particularly in Switzerland and parts of England. These craftsmen produced intricate mechanical timepieces in small workshops, assembling delicate components by hand. Their watches were admired for their quality, but the process was slow, expensive, and difficult to scale. As a result, most reliable watches in the United States were imported from Europe. These watches were often beautifully made, but they were costly and difficult to repair because their parts were not standardized. At the same time, American industry was beginning to experiment with a different philosophy of manufacturing. In factories producing firearms, sewing machines, and agricultural equipment, engineers were developing systems based on machine tools and interchangeable parts. Instead of individual craftsmen building entire products by hand, factories divided production into specialized tasks supported by precision machinery. The approach dramatically increased efficiency, but applying it to watchmaking seemed almost impossible. A mechanical watch was one of the most delicate machines of the 19th century, containing dozens of tiny components: gears, springs, pivots, screws, and jeweled bearings that had to interact with extraordinary precision. Even microscopic imperfections could disrupt the entire mechanism. Many European watchmakers believed such devices could only be produced through careful craftsmanship performed by experienced artisans. Yet a small group of American industrial thinkers believed otherwise. They argued that the same manufacturing principles transforming other industries could also be applied to precision timekeeping. With the right combination of machinery, organization, and engineering discipline, watches could be produced inside factories rather than small workshops. If successful, reliable watches could become far more affordable and widely available. Accurate timekeeping would no longer belong only to wealthy customers, but could reach railroad workers, merchants, engineers, and ordinary citizens whose lives increasingly depended on punctuality. It was a bold and risky proposition. But in the early 1860s, a group of investors in Chicago decided the experiment was worth attempting. Led by businessman Philo Carpenter, they began organizing a company with the goal of building a factory capable of producing high-quality watches using modern industrial methods. In 1864, during one of the most turbulent years of the American Civil War, they formally incorporated what would become the National Watch Company. Their plan was ambitious. Instead of scattered workshops and individual craftsmen, they would construct a large factory designed specifically for the industrial production of precision timepieces. If the project succeeded, it could reshape the global watch industry. If it failed, it would confirm what European watchmakers had long believed, that precision timekeeping could never truly be industrialized. But the men behind the project believed they were about to prove the world wrong, because they were not simply starting a watch company. They were attempting to build the first truly industrial watch factory in America. Chapter 2: The Founding of Elgin. In 1864, while the United States was still consumed by the chaos of the Civil War, a group of businessmen in Chicago decided to attempt something many experts considered reckless. For centuries, watchmaking had been dominated by European craftsmen, and the idea that an American factory could mass-produce precision watches was widely dismissed as unrealistic. Yet a small group of investors believed the growing industrial power of the United States made such an experiment possible. Among them was Philo Carpenter, a respected Chicago businessman whose support helped organize the financial backing needed to launch the project. The men behind the company were not simply cautious investors. They were effectively wagering that the future of watchmaking would belong to industrial machinery rather than traditional craft workshops. In August 1864, they formally incorporated the National Watch Company, built around a bold idea that one of the most delicate mechanical instruments ever created could be manufactured using the same industrial principles already transforming American industries such as firearms and agricultural equipment. If the experiment succeeded, watches could be produced more efficiently and at lower cost than ever before. If it failed, it would confirm what European watchmakers had long believed, that precision timekeeping could never be industrialized. Choosing the right location for the factory was critical. After considering several sites near Chicago, the organizers selected a small settlement about 40 miles northwest of the city, along the Fox River. The town of Elgin offered several advantages. It was connected to Chicago by the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad, allowing materials and finished watches to move efficiently between the factory and one of the fastest-growing commercial centers in the country. The Fox River provided access to water power, and the surrounding region offered a growing supply of workers needed to operate a large manufacturing operation. Once the site was chosen, construction began on a facility unlike anything the watch industry had seen before. Instead of a small workshop filled with individual craftsmen, the National Watch Company planned a large factory designed specifically for organized industrial production. The building rose along the banks of the Fox River as a massive brick structure with wide floors and long rows of windows that allowed natural light to flood the interior workspaces. In an era before electric lighting, this daylight was essential for workers who would soon be handling components so small they were barely visible to the naked eye. Yet constructing the factory was only the first challenge. The greater difficulty lay in creating the machinery that would make industrial watch production possible. Many of the tools required to manufacture watch components with extreme precision did not yet exist. Engineers had to develop specialized machines capable of cutting gears, shaping springs, drilling microscopic holes, and polishing jewel bearings with extraordinary accuracy. The early years were therefore filled with technical experimentation. Engineers refined tools, adjusted production methods, and trained workers to assemble miniature mechanical systems whose tolerances were far smaller than those used in most other industries. Progress was slow, and at times the entire project must have seemed dangerously close to failure. Gradually, however, the system began to work. By the late 1860s, the factory succeeded in producing its first commercially viable watches. These early models demonstrated that the company's approach, combining machine production with carefully organized assembly, could produce reliable watches that rivaled imported European timepieces while remaining more affordable. Demand grew quickly. Customers across the United States began recognizing the watches produced in Elgin as symbols of dependable American manufacturing. In 1865, the town itself formally adopted the name Elgin, reflecting how closely its identity had become tied to the rapidly growing watch factory. The success of those first watches represented more than a commercial victory. It proved that the industrial system the company had built, machines, standardized parts, and organized factory production, could succeed in an industry long dominated by small workshops and individual craftsmen. What had begun as a risky industrial experiment was beginning to look like the foundation of a new watchmaking empire. That success raised a far more ambitious possibility. If one factory in Illinois could manufacture watches using industrial methods, then production might expand far beyond what anyone had originally imagined. The experiment had proven that watches could be built in factories. The next question was far more radical. Could they be produced by the millions? Chapter 3. Building the first watchmaking machine. By the late 1860s, the experiment that began in Elgin was evolving into something far more ambitious than its founders had imagined. The National Watch Company had proven that mechanical watches could be produced inside a factory rather than assembled entirely by individual craftsmen. But producing watches in small batches was only the beginning. The true objective was far more radical: to build an industrial system capable of manufacturing precision timepieces on a scale the watch industry had never seen before. Traditional watchmaking, particularly in Switzerland, had developed over centuries as a decentralized craft. Individual artisans or small workshops produced components that were later assembled into finished watches. A single watchmaker might spend days carefully shaping gears, adjusting springs, and fitting delicate parts together by hand. The process produced remarkable craftsmanship, but it was slow and inherently limited in scale. The factory rising along the Fox River in Elgin represented a completely different philosophy. Instead of treating a watch as a handcrafted object, the company began to treat it as a machine that could be manufactured by other machines. The principle guiding this approach came from the emerging American system of manufacturing, which relied on standardized components and specialized machine tools to produce consistent parts at high volume. Applying that philosophy to watchmaking required rethinking the entire process. A mechanical watch contains dozens of tiny components: gears, springs, plates, screws, pivots, and jeweled bearings that must interact with extreme precision. Even slight variations could cause the mechanism to lose accuracy or stop completely. Elgin's engineers therefore focused on developing machines capable of producing these components with microscopic consistency. Inside the Elgin factory, production gradually evolved into a coordinated manufacturing system. Rather than one craftsman assembling an entire watch, the work was divided into specialized departments responsible for different stages of production. The factory floor was filled with machines designed to repeat precise operations thousands of times with minimal variation. In the gear cutting department, machines carved teeth into brass and steel wheels that formed the heart of every watch movement. Each gear had to mesh perfectly with the next in the gear train, transferring energy from the mainspring through a carefully calibrated sequence of rotations. Workers monitored the machines closely, ensuring that every component met strict dimensional standards. Nearby, in the jewel setting department, technicians handled one of the most delicate tasks in the factory. Tiny ruby or sapphire bearings, known as jewels, were inserted into the watch plates to support the rotating pivots of the gear train. These jewels reduced friction and allowed the movement to operate smoothly for long periods of time. Other sections focused on the outer components that protected the mechanism itself. In the manufacturing and polishing departments, workers shaped and finished the metal shells that housed the watch movements. These cases were polished to a fine finish, in transforming a precision instrument into an object customers could carry with pride. Once the components were ready, they moved to the movement assembly department, where skilled workers combined gears, springs, plates, and escapements into functioning watch mechanisms. The delicate balance wheel and escapement, the parts responsible for regulating time, were carefully installed and adjusted to ensure accurate performance. After assembly, every watch passed through inspection and testing. Inspectors examined the movements under magnification, checking for flaws that might affect performance. Each watch was tested for accuracy before leaving the factory. What made the Elgin system powerful was not a single machine, but the coordination of the entire process. Hundreds of workers and machines operated simultaneously, each contributing to a structured sequence of production steps that transformed raw materials into finished watches. At the center of this system was one of the most important innovations in industrial manufacturing: interchangeable parts. Components were produced so consistently that they could be assembled without individual adjustment. If a gear or spring failed, it could simply be replaced with an identical piece. For many traditional watchmakers in Europe, the American approach seemed almost impossible. Swiss craftsmen had spent generations perfecting handcrafted methods and doubted that factory machinery could match their precision. But the watches emerging from Elgin told a different story. They were accurate, dependable, and increasingly affordable. As the factory expanded its machinery and workforce throughout the 1870s and 1880s, production volumes climbed steadily. What had once been a delicate craft practiced in scattered workshops was becoming a large-scale industrial operation. The factory in Elgin was no longer merely participating in the watch industry, it was beginning to reshape. Because by the end of the 19th century, the Elgin National Watch Company was no longer simply competing with traditional watchmakers, it was outproducing them. Chapter 4: America's Timekeeper. By the closing decades of the 19th century, the industrial experiment that began in a quiet Illinois town had grown into something far larger than its founders could have imagined. The Elgin National Watch Company was no longer simply proving that watches could be manufactured inside a factory. It had built one of the most powerful watchmaking operations in the world. Inside its expanding complex along the Fox River, precision machines ran continuously, cutting gears, polishing cases, and assembling delicate mechanical movements that would soon travel far beyond the town that produced them. Production numbers alone revealed the scale of that transformation. Year after year, the Elgin factory increased its output as new machines were installed and additional workers joined the production lines. By the turn of the 20th century, the company was producing watches in the hundreds of thousands each year. Over time, those numbers accumulated into something extraordinary. Across its long history, the factory would manufacture nearly 60 million watches, making Elgin one of the most prolific watchmakers in American history. Supporting that production was a workforce that transformed the small town of Elgin into a center of industrial precision. At its peak, the factory employed more than 4,000 workers. Machinists, assemblers, inspectors, and technicians moved through the factory gates each day, each responsible for a specific stage in the intricate process of building a watch. Entire neighborhoods grew around the factory, and the rhythms of the town became inseparable from the rhythms of its machines. But Elgin's influence extended far beyond Illinois. Through an expanding network of jewelers and retailers, Elgin watches reached customers across the United States. From major East Coast cities to small towns across the Midwest and the expanding frontier of the American West, the company's watches became widely recognized symbols of reliable American craftsmanship. For many Americans, purchasing a watch marked an important personal milestone, an investment in punctuality, responsibility, and professional life. No industry depended more heavily on precise timekeeping than the rapidly expanding railroad system. Railroads relied on strict schedules to coordinate train movements across thousands of miles of track, and particularly on single-line routes where trains traveling in opposite directions shared the same rails. Even small errors in timing could lead to catastrophic collisions. Elgin watches earned the trust of this demanding system. Their reliability made them well-suited for the strict accuracy standards imposed on railroad workers responsible for coordinating departures, managing schedules, and ensuring safe travel across the country. By the early 20th century, the name Elgin had become synonymous with dependable timekeeping. Advertisements emphasized precision, durability, and reliability, presenting the company's watches as essential tools for modern life in an increasingly industrial society. At the same time, pocket watches carried a powerful cultural meaning. Worn in a vest pocket and attached to a chain, they were both practical instruments and visible symbols of responsibility. Watches were often given as graduation gifts, retirement presents, or tokens marking important milestones in a person's life. By the early decades of the 20th century, the company stood at the height of its power. The factory continued producing watches in enormous numbers. The workforce remained one of the largest in the industry, and the Elgin name had become a national symbol of precision manufacturing. For a time, the company appeared unstoppable. It had taken an ancient craft and transformed it into a modern industrial system, capable of producing watches on a scale few competitors could match. But industrial empires often reach their greatest height just before the forces that will challenge them begin to gather. Behind the impressive production numbers, subtle pressures were already beginning to emerge. Machinery that had powered the factory for decades was aging. Global competitors were modernizing their own manufacturing systems, and technological changes were beginning to reshape the watch industry. At the height of its success, the Elgin National Watch Company seemed like a permanent pillar of American industry. Yet the very system that had built its dominance would soon face challenges it had never been designed to withstand. Chapter 5: War Profits and Industrial Pressure. By the early 20th century, the Elgin National Watch Company had become one of the most established watch manufacturers in the United States. Its factory in Illinois had spent decades refining the industrial production of mechanical watches, and its timepieces had become trusted instruments for railroad workers, engineers, merchants, and professionals across the country. Yet the next phase of the company's history would not be shaped primarily by consumer markets. It would be shaped by war. When World War I erupted in 1914, modern warfare created new demands for precise coordination between troops, artillery units, and supply operations. In such an environment, accurate timekeeping became an important military tool. Watches were used to coordinate artillery barrages, synchronize troop movements, and maintain operational timing in rapidly changing battlefield conditions. Although the United States did not enter the war until 1917, American manufacturers like Elgin were drawn into the broader wartime industrial system. The company began producing watches designed for military use, timepieces that needed to remain reliable under harsh conditions, including shock, dust, and temperature changes. Engineers adjusted designs and strengthened components to ensure these watches could withstand battlefield environments. But the real transformation came during World War II. By the early 1940s, the scale of global conflict demanded an unprecedented mobilization of American industry. Factories across the country were converted to military production, manufacturing everything from aircraft engines to navigation instruments. In 1942, the Elgin National Watch Company made a decisive shift. The company stopped producing civilian watches entirely. Instead, the factory devoted its production capacity to military contracts for the United States Armed Forces. Assembly lines that once produced consumer pocket watches were reorganized to manufacture specialized timing instruments used in aircraft, naval vessels, and field operations. The factory began producing cockpit clocks, navigation timers, and rugged military watches designed to function in extreme environments. Inside the factory, the pace of work intensified dramatically. Production schedules tightened as government contracts required strict delivery deadlines. Machines that had once operated during normal shifts now ran for extended hours as departments pushed to meet wartime quotas. But this transformation placed enormous strain on the factory. Many experienced male workers had left to serve in the armed forces, creating sudden labor shortages across the plant. To maintain production levels, the company began recruiting and training large numbers of women workers, many of whom stepped into technical roles that had previously been dominated by men. Inside the Elgin factory, these new workers quickly learned the precision required by watch manufacturing. They operated gear-cutting machines, assembled delicate components, and inspected intricate mechanisms under magnification. The work demanded steady concentration and careful coordination, often performed for long hours under the pressure of wartime production schedules. At the same time, the factory's machinery was beginning to show signs of fatigue. Much of the equipment powering the Elgin production system had been designed decades earlier during the company's early expansion. Although the machines had been maintained and upgraded over time, the relentless pace of wartime manufacturing accelerated wear and tear across the factory floor. Machine tools ran continuously. Your departments pushed equipment beyond normal operating cycles, and maintenance crews struggled to keep aging systems functioning reliably. For a time, the wartime boom appeared to strengthen the company. Military contracts kept the factory operating at full capacity, and Elgin remained an important part of the American war effort. But the war was quietly extracting a cost. The factory's machinery had been pushed to its limits. The Canton and the industrial system that powered Elgin's success was beginning to show its age. At the same time, the economic landscape surrounding American manufacturing was shifting. Labor costs were rising. Global competition was expanding, and the industrial advantages that once defined companies like Elgin were becoming harder to sustain. During the war years, these pressures remained largely hidden. Military demand kept the factory running. Urgency of wartime production left little room to question the long-term stability of the system. But when the war ended, that protective shield would disappear, and the watch industry would soon face forces far more disruptive than wartime production pressure. Chapter 6. The Technology That Destroyed the Industry. By the end of the Second World War, the Elgin National Watch Company still possessed one of the most experienced watchmaking workforces in the United States, and a factory that had produced millions of timepieces over nearly a century. But the industrial system that had once made Elgin powerful was beginning to face pressures it had never encountered before. The watch industry that emerged after 1945 looked very different from the one that had existed during the company's early years of dominance. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, American watch manufacturers such as Elgin had thrived because their industrial methods allowed them to produce mechanical watches at scale. Interchangeable parts, specialized departments, and precision machine tools had turned watchmaking into a modern manufacturing system. For decades, that system allowed American companies to compete effectively against the traditional craft workshops of Europe. But after the war, global manufacturing began shifting rapidly. Improvements in international trade and transportation allowed watches produced overseas to enter American markets far more easily than before. Manufacturers in countries with lower labor costs were able to produce mechanical watches at prices American factories struggled to match. For companies like Elgin, the challenge was not only foreign competition but the structure of their own industrial systems. Massive factories that had once symbolized efficiency were now expensive to operate, requiring thousands of workers and complex production processes. Throughout the 1950s, these pressures slowly began eroding the position American watchmakers had once enjoyed. Imports increased, price competition intensified, and domestic manufacturers struggled to adapt their aging production systems to a rapidly changing global market. For Elgin, whose factory had been built around mechanical manufacturing, adapting would have required enormous investment. Instead, the company attempted to survive within the system it already knew. Production slowed as demand shifted. Costs continued rising while foreign watches became increasingly accessible to American consumers. The factory that had once represented the future of industrial watchmaking was gradually becoming tied to the past. By the early 1960s, the situation had become increasingly difficult. American watch manufacturers were no longer the dominant force they had once been. Mechanical watches themselves were beginning to look less like technological marvels and more like products from an earlier industrial era. Then, in 1965, the Elgin factory in Illinois stopped producing watches altogether. And after more than a century of manufacturing, the production lines that had built nearly 60 million timepieces were shut down. The factory that had once defined American watchmaking had reached the end of its life. Yet the technological shock that would soon reshape the global watch industry had not even arrived yet. Just 4 years later, in 1969, the Japanese company Seiko introduced a watch that represented one of the most significant breakthroughs in the history of timekeeping. Called the Seiko Astron, It replaced the traditional mechanical movement with an electronic system based on a quartz crystal. When electricity passes through quartz, the crystal vibrates at a stable frequency that can be measured electronically. This allowed watches to keep time far more accurately than traditional mechanical movements. The consequences for the watch industry were enormous. Quartz watches required far fewer moving parts than mechanical timepieces. Electronic circuits replaced complex gear systems, and automated manufacturing allowed watches to be produced at dramatically lower cost. During the 1970s, this technological shift triggered what historians now call the quartz crisis, a disruption that devastated traditional mechanical watchmaking. Even the Swiss industry, long considered the center of global watchmaking, struggled to adapt. For the American watch industry, however, the consequences were even more severe. Companies like Elgin had already been weakened by rising costs, aging infrastructure, and global competition. Their factories had been built around mechanical manufacturing systems that could not easily transition into electronic production. In that sense, quartz technology did not destroy Elgin directly. The factory had already fallen silent. Instead, quartz marked the final transformation of the world Elgin had once dominated. It replaced the mechanical era in which companies like Elgin had thrived with a new technological order built on electronics, automation, and globalized manufacturing. For nearly a century, the Elgin National Watch Company had mastered the art of building mechanical timepieces. But the world those machines belonged to was disappearing. And once that world vanished, the empire built to serve it could not survive. Chapter 7. The Collapse. By the early 1960s, the factory in Elgin, Illinois had already survived nearly a century of industrial history. It had endured economic recessions, global wars, and the constant evolution of American manufacturing. For generations of workers, the massive brick complex along the Fox River had represented stability. Every morning, thousands of employees entered the factory gates, took their places along carefully organized production lines, and participated in a process that had once made the company one of the most powerful watch manufacturers in the United States. But by this point, the steady rhythm that had defined the factory for decades was beginning to change. Orders were no longer arriving with the same consistency they once had. The watch industry was becoming more competitive, and foreign manufacturers were producing timepieces at prices American factories struggled to match. As the economic pressures of the post-war world intensified, the Elgin National Watch Company began quietly reducing production. The change was gradual at first, almost subtle. Certain departments shortened their working hours. Some machines that had once operated continuously now sat idle for portions of the day. Workers noticed the difference immediately. For decades, the factory floor had been defined by constant movement. Machines turned with mechanical precision. Inspectors examined delicate watch movements beneath magnifying lenses, and trays filled with tiny gears and springs moved steadily between departments. Now that movement was slowing, fewer watches were moving through the assembly process, and sections of the factory that had once been filled with activity began to grow strangely quiet. As the months passed, management was forced to confront a reality that had once seemed almost impossible. The production system that had powered Elgin's success for nearly a century was no longer sustainable at its original scale. Layoffs began. At first, they were small reductions, affecting only certain departments whose workloads had declined. But the cuts continued. Workers who had spent decades mastering the delicate craft of assembling mechanical watch movements suddenly found themselves without work. Entire teams that had once operated specialized machinery were gradually dismantled as the company struggled to reduce operating costs. For the town of Elgin, the consequences were immediate and deeply personal. The watch factory had long been the largest employer in the area. Generations of families had depended on its payroll. Parents had worked there, their children often followed them, and entire neighborhoods had grown around the steady employment the company provided. When layoffs began spreading through the factory, the effects moved quickly through the community. Local businesses that had relied on factory workers as customers began feeling the strain. Restaurants grew quieter during lunch hours. Small shops saw fewer customers walking through their doors. The economic system that had grown around the watch factory for nearly a century was beginning to unravel. Inside the plant, the atmosphere grew increasingly uncertain. Workers arriving for their shifts could not always be sure how long those shifts would continue. Rumors circulated about further production cuts and possible restructuring. Machines that had once operated for decades without interruption were gradually shut down and left standing motionless along the factory floor. For employees who had spent much of their lives inside the building, the change was deeply unsettling. And many had developed specialized skills that existed almost nowhere else outside the watch industry. Gear cutters, jewel setters, movement assemblers, and inspectors had mastered forms of precision work that required years of experience to perfect. Yet the industry those skills belonged to was slowly disappearing around them. By the early 1960s, it had become increasingly clear that the company's options were running out. Management explored different strategies to preserve the business. But the economic realities confronting American watch manufacturers were difficult to overcome. Production costs remained high, foreign competitors continued expanding their presence in the market, and the massive industrial infrastructure required to build mechanical watches was becoming harder to sustain. Finally, after months of uncertainty, the announcement arrived. In 1965, the Elgin National Watch Company officially ended watch manufacturing at its historic Illinois factory. For the workers inside the plant, the news marked the end of an era that had defined their lives and the identity of the town itself. The factory that had produced watches for nearly 100 years would no longer operate as a watchmaking facility. The final weeks inside the factory were marked by a quiet sense of inevitability. Machines that had once operated with relentless precision were gradually powered down for the last time. Workstations were cleared as remaining production orders were completed. Tool drawers were emptied, and departments that had once been filled with activity slowly emptied as workers finished their final shifts. Where thousands of employees had once moved through crowded aisles and production benches, long rows of equipment now stood silent. For decades, the factory had been filled with the steady mechanical rhythm of watchmaking, the faint grinding of gear-cutting machines, the careful tapping of tools used to assemble delicate movements, the quiet ticking of newly finished watches being tested for accuracy. Now those sounds are gone. By the time the last watches left the building, the factory that had produced nearly 60 million timepieces had fallen silent. For the first time since the 1860s, the industrial heart of Elgin had stopped beating. The town still remained. The building still stood along the river. But the vast system that had once filled those buildings with machines, workers, and the constant motion of industrial production had vanished. The watches that left the factory would continue measuring time for years to come. But the place where they had been made was finished. Chapter 8. The Ghost of Elgin. When watch production ended in 1965, the closure of the Elgin National Watch Company did not immediately erase the factory from the landscape of Illinois. The enormous complex along the Fox River still stood for years afterward, its long brick walls and tall rows of windows stretching across the riverbank as reminders of nearly a century of industrial ambition. But the life that had once filled those buildings had disappeared. The machines that had cut gears and polished cases were gone. The workbenches where thousands of workers had assembled delicate mechanical movements now sat empty. What remained was a silent industrial shell that seemed strangely disconnected from the world it had once powered. For the town of Elgin, the absence was impossible to ignore. For generations, the watch factory had been more than a workplace. It had been the center of the city's identity. Entire neighborhoods had grown around the steady employment the factory provided. Families had built their lives around its shifts, its payroll, and the stability it promised. When the factory stopped producing watches, that stability vanished with it. Skilled watchmakers who had spent decades perfecting specialized tasks suddenly found themselves searching for new forms of work in industries that often had little use for their particular expertise. Some former employees found jobs in other manufacturing plants scattered across the Midwest. Others moved into entirely different professions as the regional economy began shifting away from the kind of precision mechanical manufacturing that had once defined towns like Elgin. For many workers, however, the transition was difficult. The craft they had mastered inside the watch factory belonged to an industrial world that was slowly disappearing. Over time, the physical presence of that world also began to fade. Without the watchmaking operation that had justified its enormous size, much of the factory complex fell into disuse. Some sections were briefly repurposed for other businesses, but maintaining such a vast industrial structure proved increasingly impractical. Gradually, portions of the facility were demolished. Brick walls that had once enclosed thousands of workers were torn down, and the machinery that had powered one of America's largest watchmaking operations vanished into scrap yards and storage warehouses. Eventually, very little remained of the factory that had once produced nearly 60 million watches. Yet the name Elgin did not disappear. In a quiet twist of corporate history, the brand itself survived through licensing agreements that allowed other companies to place the historic name on watches manufactured elsewhere. These products carried the Elgin label, but they had no connection to the factory that had built the reputation behind that name. The brand endured, while the industrial system that created it had been erased. The irony was difficult to ignore. For nearly a century, the town of Elgin had built watches that traveled across the United States and around the world. But when the factory closed, the watches remained while the place that made them slowly vanished. In that sense, the disappearance of the Elgin factory was not just the end of a single company. It was part of a much larger transformation unfolding across the American Midwest. Throughout the 20th century, cities that had once thrived on steel production, heavy machinery, and precision manufacturing began confronting the decline of the industrial systems that had built them. Factories that once defined entire communities closed or moved overseas, leaving behind empty buildings and workforces forced to adapt to a new economic reality. The watch factory in Elgin had once symbolized the promise of American industrial power. By the time it disappeared, it had become something else. A reminder that even the most successful industrial empires can eventually become ghosts. Final chapter: what Elgin really represents. The story of the Elgin National Watch Company is not simply the rise and fall of a watch manufacturer. It is the story of a particular moment in American industrial history, a time when the country believed that machines, organization, and engineering could transform even the most delicate crafts into systems of mass production. When Elgin was founded in 1864, watchmaking had been a centuries-old European tradition, dominated by small workshops and skilled artisans. The factory, built along the Fox River, represented something entirely different. It was an attempt to apply the logic of modern industry to one of the most intricate mechanical devices ever invented. Gears, springs, and jeweled bearings were no longer assembled in scattered workshops, but inside a coordinated manufacturing system capable of producing watches by the thousands. For decades, that system worked with remarkable success. The Elgin factory produced millions of watches and helped establish the United States as a serious force in global watchmaking. More importantly, it demonstrated the extraordinary power of industrial organization. A device that once required days of individual craftsmanship could now be produced in enormous quantities by machines operating within a carefully designed factory ecosystem. But the same forces that built that industrial machine also contained the seeds of its disappearance. Industrial systems are designed to solve the problems of their own era. The Elgin factory was built for a world where precision mechanical devices represented the pinnacle of technology. It thrived in an age of railroads, factory whistles, and mechanical engineering. Yet technology does not stand still, and the systems that once represent the future eventually become tied to the past. When that shift occurs, the very structures that once made a company powerful can become its greatest limitation. The factory in Elgin was built to manufacture mechanical watches with extraordinary efficiency. But when the technological and economic foundations of that industry changed, the vast machinery, specialized workforce, and industrial infrastructure that had once defined its strength could not easily adapt to a different kind of world. This is the quiet paradox at the center of Elgin's story. The factory that once represented the future of industrial precision eventually became a monument to an earlier technological age. For nearly a century, millions of watches left its assembly lines, each designed to measure the steady passage of seconds and minutes. But time does not only move inside a watch, it moves through industries, technologies, and the factories that build them. For nearly 100 years, Elgin measured time for America. In the end, time measured Elgin.